Hey guys, my name is Jose Ocondo. I'm a Chattanooga-based web designer and a Webflow developer, and in this video we're talking about the very exciting topic of responsive website development in Webflow. I've created this kind of like microsite where we can go through and in real time make these responsive changes so you guys can take those techniques and apply them to your own projects. Before we get started, I just want to say a special thank you to Alexandru Asea. I hope I'm saying your name right, but Alexandru, I love your photos. They're beautiful, and I use them to populate this website. So just wanted to say thank you, and I encourage you guys to check out his profile here on Unsplash. All right, so let's begin with talking about the container class. So container classes are kind of like the foundational element for creating responsiveness. By creating a container that responds to the width of the browser, if you put all of your content, if you nest all of your content in that container class, then all of your content across your website will respond to the width of the browser. Pretty key idea, right? So here we've got an example now. I created a combo class and I added a gray border, kind of like a bounding box around the container so you can see exactly where it is. And right now, if I click on it, you'll notice that it's set to a width of 1080 pixels. As I scroll in the browser, you'll notice that eventually it breaks, it overlaps the browser, and it doesn't look good. All right, so what we want to do is we want to use a proportional container instead. So instead of 1080 pixels, I'm going to make this 85%. You'll notice immediately that this now jumps to be fairly a bit wider. And if I start to scroll in my browser again, you'll notice that the container is now responding to the browser width. And not only that, but eventually when it's close enough to the text will now start to respond and cascade down to the next line to make sure there's plenty of room and white space. That's exactly what we want. Now, if you don't like how wide that particularly is, you can always use a max width to make sure that your container doesn't exceed a certain amount. So, for example, let's say we liked that 1080 pixels. Now it kind of snaps back to that original location. But once we get close enough, it's responding again, and the text is now responding as well. So that is the beauty of a responsive container. Again, your website structure should be, if I collapse all of this, you should have a body tag. Well, in Webflow, you're always going to have that body tag. You should have sections inside of that body tag, and each section should have a container. The exception would be, of course, full bleed sections where, for whatever reason, you need the content to be the full width of the browser. All right, so that's the container class. Next up, let's talk about responsive or proportional units. Now, here we're talking about typography in general. We're going to be styling this piece of white text in the background that says responsive. But this is really a tip for any object or element that you're trying to style some dimension to it. You don't have to restrict yourself to using hard pixels. Consider using proportional units. Here I've listed them out. There are percentages, ems, rems, viewport width, and viewport height. And in this example here, we're going to be using VW or viewport width to style our, am I in the wrong section here? I am. To style this piece of text. Now right now, it's kind of doing what I wanted to do. I wanted this kind of like editorial look where the word responsive is huge. It spans the entire width of the browser, and it kind of exceeds the edge a little bit. But when I go to preview mode, you'll notice that now it doesn't have that same effect. It's not scaling beyond the browser. I'm not saying it looks bad. It's just not what I want, where I intended with my design. And the reason for that is because I've got 390 pixels as the hard fixed amount. So instead of using pixels, let's try using viewport width to style the font size. I'm going to start off with 20 and see where that gets us. We're going to do 20 VW. It's a bit too small, so just using the arrow keys, I'm going to just go up one at a time. And right there is perfect. 24 VW. If I hop back into the preview, it's now responding so that where previously there was that white text, It's not overlapping the edges of the browser like I want. And not only that, but when I scroll in, it's responding to the browser and scaling in, but still fixing to that kind of like edge-to-edge look that I want. All right, so that's proportional units. Next up, let's look at Flexbox Wrap Children. I have found this technique to be super helpful for anything like, well, here I've got an about section with team profile pictures. It could also be useful for like a blog collection. If you have a row of thumbnails and article titles, this would be super helpful for that kind of thing as well. So what I mean is that right now, these profile pictures look pretty good. They're side by side, there's plenty of white space. But if I hop down into the tablet mode, I notice that it's now broken. The profiles are overlapping the edge of the screen in an unsightly way, and that's definitely not what we want. Not only that, but if I copy this and I want to add more to this, like let's say I'm using a Webflow collection and I'm having it add these automatically, as I add them, they start breaking. They're going beyond the edge of the screen in one single line to infinity. And that's also not what we want. So I'm going to make one small change that is going to fix all of that. And that is over here in the layout section under children, I'm going to click wrap. Now, if I go to tablet mode, my profile pictures are now wrapping to the next line, or cascading down to the next line to make sure they have enough room. And essentially what this wrap children thing does is it makes sure that as soon as the elements start to overlap each other or they exceed the browser, then they snap down to the next line. So super useful. Not only that, but if I copy and start pasting this in, it's going to start pasting these below instead of pasting these in a single and infinite line. So super useful for CMS collections as well. All right, let's move on to Flexbox Alignment Reverse. I have found this particular technique to be super helpful for, you know what I just realized? I think I made, I think I left this 1080 pixels on and I want to actually take that off. There we go. Okay, because this should be bigger. All right, that's now nice and big. And I found the Flexbox alignment technique to be really helpful for these two-column layouts. Here in this particular example, I've got this image on the left and then supporting content on the right. It's a very common layout for websites. And this alignment thing just makes it super easy to go from a two-column layout on desktop to a one-column layout on tablet or mobile. So let's actually see how this works. So again, here on desktop, it looks great. Once I go to tablet, though, it doesn't look as good. The image is way too small, and the text is starting to feel pretty scrunched. So if I go to the Flexbox parent that's holding all this content, I can simply change the direction from horizontal to vertical, and we're starting to see some improvement. They're now stacking on top of each other in a one-column layout, and that's pretty good, but we can do better. I'm going to click on my image that I set to 50% and change it to 100. I'm going to give it 30 pixels of margin on the bottom, and I'm going to switch the alignment from middle to left, and now we've got this beautiful layout where my image is on the right and my content is here. If I really wanted to, I could get rid of this max width, so I could say none, and now the paragraph looks a little bit more natural. Okay, so that is Flexbox Alignment Reverse. Next up is keeping your classes tidy. This is a pretty simplistic foundational concept, and so some of you guys might think, should you have included this in your 10 tips? But the answer is a resounding yes, because thinking strategically about your classes is critical to developing a good website and Webflow, or any website in general. Let me give you an example. I had a client who hired me a couple of months ago, and they wanted to build their website in Webflow. They wanted to do it themselves, and they just wanted me to kind of consult. They wanted me to come after them and just make sure that they had done the work correctly. The problem was when I went in after they had created the site, I realized that anytime they had a new element, they created a brand new CSS class to go with it. And so anytime I found a bug, in order to fix that bug, not only would I have to change that in that one spot, but I'd have to go to multiple elements across multiple pages to make sure that bug got squashed. And that's not what we want. We want to be able to, with one kind of like simple streamlined class, be able to make changes across the website in a way that doesn't break it, but just makes it really easy on us in the future. Let's look at a real-world example of how this affects responsiveness or just creating websites in general. And so here I've got basically the same exact thing as the section above it, but I want it to be reversed. I want the image on the right-hand side, and I want the content on the left. So what my client would have done is create a whole new CSS class to achieve that. But instead, what we're going to do is just add a reverse combo class, and here under direction, change it to reverse. All right, so just by that one change, that one combo class, we've now achieved exactly the layout we want. We have the same kind of like overlapping structure so that it just kind of feels like there's a pattern to this site, and it looks good. All right, so that's keeping your classes tidy. I'm going to take a little break here to rest my voice, and we're going to jump back in a second to the next 5 tips. All right, I give myself a little bit of a voice break, and now we get to move on to tip number 6, text columns. I'm really excited about this section for a couple of reasons. First is that text columns can be used, of course, with paragraphs and text elements to create really attractive kind of editorial looks. But you don't have to have just text. So in this situation, we created 3 columns with the text column technique, and then we filled those columns with images. By doing that, we created this really fun masonry grid, and masonry grids are, I think they're named after kind of like that brick laying pattern where the where 2 bricks meet is kind of like in the middle of the adjoining brick. But anyways, places or websites like Pinterest kind of like made the masonry grid really popular, and for a reason. It looks really attractive, and it kind of helps you to scan the images in a different way. But anyways, we created this masonry grid, or I did, I should say, with text columns. So let's dig into the code and actually see how this works. So if I go to the masonry grid parent here, and you scroll down to the typography section, this column, I don't know what you'd call this, field, is where I created the columns. So if I just get rid of that, by entering in 3, I've created our columns, and you'll notice that the spacing is a little off between the elements. That's because if I click the expand menu, I can go ahead and set the gap between the elements. I think that was probably like 20 pixels, just kind of automatically. You can even add lines in between your columns and give them a color, all that stuff. But just with those 2 styles, I was able to create this really attractive masonry grid. The reason I think it's a good tip for responsiveness is because it's now really easy to make a change to this masonry grid in tablet. So maybe I think, actually it looks pretty decent here, but maybe in landscape mode, it's starting to get a little too close together, or the images are too small. No problem. So just by adding 2 here instead of 3, I can switch to a 2-column layout, but it's still retaining that spacing. I think I would maybe adjust this a little bit so that I try to get a more vertical photo here to give me that masonry grid look. But just that one change, it makes it super easy to have a responsive layout, and it still looks good on mobile. All right, so that's text columns. Next up is the max width technique. And what this has to do is with how you cause line breakages on websites. So here in this example, I don't want this paragraph or this headline to span the entire width of the container. When it's this long, it just doesn't look very attractive, and it's hard to read. I think I read somewhere that the ideal max width for a line is like 80 characters. This is probably less than that, but since it's quite a big headline, it's just a little bit difficult to read. When we break it up, it's easier for the eye to digest the sentence. So one way to do that is by clicking in here, deleting the space and hitting enter. And what that does is, if you kind of read down here, it's creating this HTML element called a break. Now that's fine, it looks great on here, but if I keep going down to, what is this called? Landscape mobile, you'll notice that all of a sudden this looks really weird. There's this unnatural line break, and that's because right after this comma, there's that BR tag. So when you do that artificial line break, it tends to create unnatural line breaks on mobile, and it's just not very attractive. So another option instead of doing that is to use max width. All right, so let's do max width. We'll just do like X. All right, and what I can do is here under max width, I can add something like, let's start off with 500 pixels. Oh, by the way, you have to make sure that this is set to auto margin on both sides, so it's in the middle. And we're just gonna kind of like key this up a little bit at a time until we get to that place where we've created our line break, and that looks pretty good. I might go just a little bit more just to make sure, and let's change this to 600. Already exists, really? Okay, we'll just leave it at X. Anyways, now when I go to that landscape mode, there's a more natural line break, and it's easier to read and it looks good. All right, so that's max width. Next up is background images. All right, this one's pretty key. I guess they're all key. Anyways, there's two types of images that you can use on a website. One is when you use the image element, and in the HTML, you get that image tag. And another is to use background images. And the way that works is that instead of being an HTML element itself, it's actually the background image is being referenced in a CSS class, and it's just referencing that image asset in your assets folder. There's a pretty big difference between those two, but and there's some drawbacks to each. But what the background image lets us do is it lets us change the dimensions of this image to whatever we want. Whereas when you add an image element, you're kind of stuck with the image ratio that you imported it as. All right, so what does that mean? So let's look at this in real time. I named this 3:4 image, and that's because it's a 3:4 ratio. And you'll notice that I gave it a width of 100% to take up this width right here. I give it a height of 0 pixels, kind of interesting, and I give it a padding of 133.33%. That's what gives me that 3:4 ratio. But I can change that up. So let's say instead of 133, I wanted to have a 2:3 ratio. I believe that's 75%. So that is now a 3:2 ratio, a little bit more of a classic thumbnail. Or let's say I wanted to have that like cinematic look. I can give it that 56.25% ratio. And now it's got more of a 16:9. But that's the beauty of background images, is that I can kind of give this whatever ratio I want, and it looks good. Okay, so how does that impact responsiveness? So so here I've got this same layout that we have above with the 2-column layout. And so I'm going to go ahead and give this a combo class, and we'll do background image layout. And I'm going to switch from horizontal to vertical. Whoops. I want to do that on mobile, or tablet, I guess I should say. I want to switch from horizontal to vertical. I want to align to the left, and I want to go ahead and give this 30 pixels of padding. All right, the other thing is this width 33. It's constraining this to 33%. I'm just going to make that 100. Now the issue here is that while it's an attractive image, it's just too tall. So if I'm scrolling on an iPad or on landscape mode, I'm like seeing a lot of image before I get to what this text is about. So to make this a little more responsive friendly, I need this image to be a more landscape ratio. So what I can do is what we did previously. I can change this to 75%. And now it's more of a landscape orientation, and it's more likely that on tablet I would see the image and the text all at the same time, kind of in the same window, and it just looks a little bit more attractive of a layout. All right, so that's the power of background images, and just FYI, in order to make sure that the image itself is responsive, I changed it to size cover so that it's always as small as possible while covering up the container, and the position is set to middle and do not tile. All right, that's background images. All right, next up is landscape declarations. And essentially what this section means is that I guess let me back up and say CSS stands for, what does it stand for? Cascading style sheets. I lost it for a second. All right, so what that means is that things cascade from the topmost element down to its children, and it cascades from, in the case of Webflow, from desktop down to portrait mode mobile. And so what we want to do is whenever we make a change, we want to make sure that it's at the highest level possible so that we don't have to set styles multiple times for different devices. All right, so in this section, we've got this like blog layout where there's 4 thumbnails. And here in tablet, it's starting to look pretty scrunched. And so here on tablet, I probably want to go ahead and switch to 2. And then on mobile, I probably want to switch to 1. So what I can do is I can add another row in tablet mode. Get my blog wrapper and scoot it over here. And get rid of my last 2 columns. All right, so with CSS Grid, we've been able to make a change that makes this really look good on tablet. Now again, on mobile, we probably want to switch to using a 1-column layout. So I could be tempted, see here it looks way too scrunched. I could be tempted to make this change directly here, but I probably don't want to do that. I probably want to go ahead into landscape mode and make the change in landscape so that everything looks good in both landscape and mobile. So I want to add 2 more rows and then bring in my wrappers. All right, let's delete this row, or column, I guess I should say. All right, so now this is gonna look nice and big and attractive on landscape, and it cascades down to mobile as well, mobile portrait, I should say, so that it's gonna look good on portrait as well. All right, so that is kind of like the essence of just trying to style things at the highest level possible so that you prevent double work. And then the last section is ephemeral units, or EMs. So if I scroll up to, I think it was maybe the second section. Yeah, we've got proportional units here, and EMs and REMs are one of them. Ephemeral units stands for EMs, and I have found that using EMs is a little bit of a better idea when it comes to styling your typography. So the way the EMs work is that if I go to my body tag, go to body all pages, you'll notice that in the typography section, I made some style choices and perhaps most important of all, I set the font size to 17 pixels. So this is like the one place where you have to set a hard pixel amount. But since I set my body font size to 17 pixels, that means that anytime I add a new M unit, it's referencing this 17 pixels, the size of my body tag. So for instance, if I go to heading 2, all H2 headings, you'll notice that I set this to 2.15 Ms. So in other words, it's 17 times 2.15. That's probably close to 32 or something like that, 32 pixels. And not only that, but my line height is an M. So when I set the M's here for my H2, it's saying it's 1.25 times 2.15. So you see how it's kind of like proportional. It's kind of like building off of that 117 pixel size for my body. And here's where it becomes kind of brilliant is just with one change, I can change the typography across my entire site. All right, so I'm here in tablet mode. If I go to body, let's say I just want the font size to be a little bit bigger in tablet mode. I can go to body all pages, and from 17 just switch to 18. You'll notice right away that all of the typography on the whole website went up by a little bit. The headline went up, this overline went up, the paragraph obviously went up, and even my drop cap here went up. All right, and then let's say in landscape mode, I want it to be even bigger because I want it to be nice and big for people to read. I can move up to 19, and it's gonna size up all of the typography across the entire site with that one change. So let me go back to desktop mode. So it's kind of up to you about, well, I guess I should say, let me back up and say that in order to use M's properly, you have to make sure that your body size uses a hard pixel, like font size, like 17 pixels. But then everything else on your font size, you have to use the M unit. And that way it's referencing that body size, and your website will respond to any changes you make in the body size. All right. If you want to go even further, you can do changes like, for example, this 20 pixels below this headline. I could make that an M unit as well. So I could say, oh, I want this to be 1.25 Ms as opposed to a 20 pixel amount. It's almost there. It's kind of close. And then as I change the body font size, it's going to increase that space in relationship to the body font size as well. So everything is kind of like proportional to itself. So just a really interesting way to build in some responsiveness to your website. All right, and that's the last of our 10 tips. I hope this was helpful to you. I'm going to go ahead and post, I'm going to finish making this site responsive and post a link to it in the comments. I'll also include a link to the Webflow link so that you can actually look in the designer to see how things were created. And you can even use these little anchor links, or these up here, to move around and just kind of like get yourself familiar with all of these tips. If you found this video to be helpful, I hope you would consider subscribing and hitting the bell so you get notified of future videos. The next video I'm going to release is a making of how I created this website, this microsite. So you'll kind of see behind the scenes of how I created all of this. And it's going to be a longer video, like an hour and a half or so. But do really fun stuff like using CSS Grid to create this and some other neat stuff. So thank you guys so much for sticking with me, and I hope I catch you soon.